What if Portugal had taken over the world? The 15th century was an exciting time for Europe. The Renaissance was in full swing. New ideas about science, art, and philosophy were changing the continent. And then there was the Great Age of Discovery, when intrepid sailors braved the unknown seas and charted new trade routes to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. But it was dangerous work. Many explorers perished at sea or in battle with other European powers. But one nation stood out above all the rest. Portugal was a small country, but it punched above its weight class and became the first global superpower. In this alternate history, we're going to explore what would have happened if Portugal had taken over the world during the Discover times. Let's get started. The Portuguese began exploring and conquering in the late 1400s. Prince Henry the Navigator established a school for navigation and spurred his countrymen to explore the coast of Africa. By 1488, Bartolomeo Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope and made his way to India. Soon after, Vasco da Gama reached the East African coast and continued on to India. These voyages opened up trade between Portugal and the riches of the East and laid the foundation for a global empire. But Portugal wasn't alone in its exploration and conquest. Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands were also eager to get their hands on the riches of the New World. The Spanish began exploring and conquering the Caribbean and South America. The British and French established colonies in North America, and the Dutch began trading with the East Indies. However, in this timeline, the Portuguese would prove to be the most successful. In 1500, the Portuguese established a trading post at the mouth of the Congo River. They quickly grew to dominate the slave trade in Africa and amassed huge fortunes from the sale of slaves to the growing colonies in the Americas. Meanwhile, they continued their exploration and conquest of Asia, where they fought many battles against the Chinese, Ottoman Turks, and other indigenous peoples. But they always came out on top. By the mid-16th century, Portugal had become the dominant power in the world. Its navy was the largest and most powerful in the world, and its army was well-trained and disciplined. Moreover, it had a large empire that stretched from Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This gave Portugal a huge advantage over its rivals, who were limited to just one or two continents each. This vast empire would allow Portugal to control the trade routes to Asia and the Americas, which meant that it could control the flow of goods and resources between these regions. For example, Portugal would be able to force China to sell its silk and porcelain at low prices because it controlled the sea routes between Asia and Europe. Similarly, it would be able to do the same thing with the Americas, which were rich in gold, silver, and other precious metals. This would allow Portugal to become incredibly wealthy and powerful. In addition, the Portuguese would be able to use their naval supremacy to project power around the world. They would have a strong military presence in every major port, and their navy would be capable of quickly moving troops and supplies anywhere in the world. This would allow them to keep their empire together and also to conquer new territories. Portugal's navy was the most powerful in the world during this time period, and it is important to understand why that was the case. First of all, the Portuguese had developed new and innovative ships that were faster and more maneuverable than those of their rivals. Additionally, they had developed new navigational techniques and instruments that allowed them to explore and conquer new lands with greater ease. Finally, the Portuguese had a well-trained and experienced navy that was composed of both professional sailors and soldiers. All of these factors combined to make Portugal's navy the most powerful in the world during the Age of Discovery. One of the main reasons for Portugal's naval supremacy was the introduction of the caravel. This was a small, fast, and maneuverable ship that was perfect for exploring and conquering new lands. The caravel was also easy to maneuver, which made it ideal for fighting in close quarters. Additionally, The Portuguese had developed new navigational techniques and instruments such as the astrolabe and the compass, which allowed them to navigate the seas with greater ease and accuracy. These advancements allowed the Portuguese to explore and conquer new lands much faster than their rivals. Another reason for Portugal's success was its well-trained and experienced navy. The Portuguese navy was composed of both professional sailors and soldiers who were well-trained in the arts of navigation and combat. They were also highly motivated by the prospect of wealth and glory. This combination of factors allowed the Portuguese to build a strong navy that was capable of exploring and conquering new lands. One of the first areas that Portugal conquered was Africa. The Portuguese began exploring and conquering Africa in the late 1400s. They quickly grew to dominate the slave trade in Africa and amassed huge fortunes from the sale of slaves to the growing colonies in the Americas. The Portuguese also explored and conquered many of the coastal areas of Africa, where they established trading posts and forts. Next, Portugal would turn its attention to Asia. The Portuguese began exploring and conquering Asia in the early 1500s. They quickly grew to dominate trade in the region and established trading posts in many major cities. The Portuguese also fought many battles against the Chinese, Ottoman Turks, and other indigenous peoples, but they always came out on top. Finally, Portugal would conquer the Americas. The Portuguese began exploring and conquering the Americas in the early 1500s. They quickly grew to dominate the trade in precious metals and other resources and established settlements in many key areas. The Portuguese also fought many battles against the Spanish and other indigenous peoples, but once again, they always came out on top. As Portugal grew richer, it would begin to invest in its infrastructure. It would build new roads, bridges, and other public works that would help to connect its far-flung empire. Additionally, Portugal would invest in its military, which would help to ensure that it could defend its empire from its rivals. In terms of culture, Portugal would become a center of Renaissance art and learning. Its cities would be home to some of the greatest artists and scholars in Europe. Additionally, the Portuguese language and literature would flourish during this time period. So what would the world look like if Portugal had taken over the world during the discovered times? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but we can make some educated guesses. First of all, the world would be a much different place if Portugal had been able to successfully conquer and control the Americas. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to reach the Americas, and they did establish some small settlements on the mainland. However, their efforts were largely overshadowed by the Spanish and the Aztecs. As we know, the Spanish would go on to conquer the Aztec Empire and much of the rest of Latin America. If Portugal had been able to defeat the Spanish in this timeline, then the course of history would have been very different. A powerful Portugal would have dominated world trade and politics. Its wealth would have been unmatched, and its power would have been unrivaled. It's also possible that Portugal's control over the Americas would have led to the earlier exploration and colonization of other parts of the New World, such as Australia and New Zealand. The Portuguese were known for their seafaring skills and their willingness to explore and conquer new lands. So it's likely that they would have continued to push westward if they had not been stopped by the Spanish. However, there is one wild card that could have changed everything: the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a major player in world politics during the 15th and 16th centuries. It controlled vital trade routes between Europe and Asia, and it posed a serious threat to Portuguese interests in the Middle East. In fact, the Ottomans would eventually capture Constantinople, which was a major blow to Portuguese power. If Portugal had been able to defeat the Ottomans in this timeline, then it would have been truly unstoppable. It would have controlled the world's most important trade routes, and it would have been the undisputed global superpower. In conclusion, a Portuguese victory in the Americas would have had profound consequences for world history. it would have resulted in a vastly different political landscape, a reshaping of global trade routes and cultural exchange, and the potential for even greater Portuguese wealth and power. However, the outcome of such a scenario is ultimately speculative and leaves us with many unanswered questions. What would the relationship between a victorious Portugal and the remaining European powers have been like? How would the indigenous populations of the Americas have fared under Portuguese rule? And how might the global balance of power have shifted in the centuries that followed? Ultimately, we can only speculate on the full ramifications of such a monumental historical shift. Thanks for watching.